Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today, taking the stack of your sources, we've got an ancient philosophical text and some really insightful analysis and digging out the most important nuggets of knowledge for you.
And today, yeah, we're diving into one of Plato's later works, maybe less famous than some, but wow, incredibly significant, the Philebus.
Ah, Plato. It's always going to be a deep dive, isn't it? And the core question here is just fundamental, as old as philosophy itself. What actually makes for a good life? Is it pleasure? Is it wisdom?
Mm.
Or is Plato taking us somewhere else entirely?
That's precisely the puzzle he's tackling. So we're going to unpack some, well, seriously intricate arguments. We'll explore a really fascinating shift in Plato's own thinking later in his life and see how these ancient ideas actually echo in modern debates, things like utilitarianism.
Okay, let's jump right in then. The source material flags the Philebus as definitely one of his later writings. What does that actually tell us?
Well, it tells us Plato's evolving, you
Hmm.
know. The sources point out it feels quite different from the earlier dialogues. It's much more focused on abstract concepts, less on that dramatic back and forth with the poetic language.
Right.
Some of the analysis even describes parts of it as feeling maybe a bit labored, or perhaps hinting at moments of, let's say, confusion and incompleteness.
So less like a neat philosophical play, maybe more like we're watching Plato grapple with these ideas in, like real time.
Almost, yeah. And a big challenge for us, and probably for his original audience too, is that he's arguing against specific philosophers of his time whose works we don't fully have.
Hmm.
Thinkers from groups like the Eleatics, Megarians, Cynics, Cyrenaics,
Hmm.
the Pythagoreans. We're often only getting Plato's side of the argument.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, though, as your sources point out. Compared to those earlier, maybe more famous dialogues, Plato seems to deliberately, well, omit or change some pretty core ideas, like that famous doctrine of recollection, where we supposedly remember knowledge from a past life.
Gone, yeah. The sources say it's replaced by something more, well, psychological. A view of memory tied much more to our current experience. And remember how central love, Eros, was in works like the Symposium.
Hugely central.
It's largely absent here. It really only pops up briefly as an illustration of something else.
Wow, okay, that's a significant shift. It really is like he's intentionally changing his toolkit. The source quotes him saying he's forging weapons of another make.
Exactly. He's developing new concepts, new philosophical sort of machinery to tackle these really fundamental questions about the good life.
Now, the deep dive into the Philebus itself, it kicks off with a classic philosophical showdown, doesn't it? You've got Philebus arguing pleasure is the ultimate good, and then Socrates steps in saying, no, it's wisdom or knowledge.
That's the initial setup, yeah. The champion of pleasure versus the champion of the mind, so to speak.
But Socrates, he doesn't just say, nope, wisdom's better, end of story. He immediately makes it more complicated. He argues you can't just say pleasure is good or wisdom is good across the board because, well, there are lots of different kinds of pleasure, right? Good ones, bad ones, wise ones, foolish ones, and same for knowledge. They aren't all the same.
And that move is just crucial. It leads straight into what's sometimes called the high argument of the one and the many. How can a single concept like pleasure or knowledge contain so much internal diversity, even, opposition within itself? Think about trying to define animal diversity. It includes insects and elephants, doesn't it?
Right, and your sources make this really fascinating connection, saying this ancient puzzle explored by Plato right here actually contains the germ of the most fruitful notion of modern science.
Exactly. That whole idea of understanding the general concept, the one, by classifying and analyzing all its specific types, the many, that's basically the foundation of scientific classification, right? Understanding species within a genus. It just shows how fundamental Plato's method still is.
So how does Plato then try to build a framework to sort out this, well, messy reality of different pleasures and knowledges, to figure out their real value? He introduces this fundamental structure of reality.
Yes, and he calls it a gift of heaven, almost like a divine blueprint outlining the basic components of everything that exists. Four fundamental classes.
Okay, 4 classes. Let's break them down. Where does he start?
So first up, the infinite or unlimited. This is the realm of things that lack inherent measure or boundary or definition. Think like hotter and colder, more and less, or just unchecked desires, appetites. Pleasure, in its unrestrained, boundless form kind of falls into this category.
Got it. Like pure potential maybe, but without any form or structure.
Exactly. Then second is the finite or limited. This is what introduces measure, limit, order, proportion, definition. It's the principal boundary. Think law, harmony, health. The sources really emphasize that for the Greeks, The good is of the nature of the finite. Order is good.
Bringing order to that potential chaos makes sense.
Precisely. Third category, the mixed or generated. This is the combination, the union of the infinite and the finite. It's where actual things come into being through this mixture. So think health, it's a proper balance, the finite imposed on bodily elements, the infinite, or music applying finite mathematical ratios to infinite sound waves. This is the world we experience, where concrete things and states exist. And Plato places wisdom and knowledge here, and it's also where pleasure and pain arise from the disturbance and then the restoration of balance within this mixture.
Ah, okay. So the actual stuff of life, where order meets the raw material, that's where knowledge fits and where pleasure and pain happen.
Yes. And then finally, the fourth class, the cause. This is the active principle that actually brings about the mixture of the finite and the infinite. Plato identifies this with reason or mind nous. It's seen as the source of order in the universe, akin to the highest good, maybe even a kind of divine intelligence structuring everything.
Reason, the architect, combining the limited and the unlimited to create the world of experience.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely see how understanding these classes is going to be crucial, because Plato's going to use them to figure out where pleasure and knowledge really fit in the grand scheme of things.
That's exactly right. By placing them within this sort of universal structure, he can assess their true nature and, importantly, their proximity to the ultimate good.
Let's zoom in on pleasure then, because Plato's analysis here is pretty detailed and, well, your sources highlight some spots where he seems to be wrestling with it a bit.
He certainly is, yeah. He describes pleasure as indefinite, relative, and really importantly as a generation or a becoming.
Okay, why is calling it generation so significant philosophically? Because, well, in Plato's broader thinking, generation or becoming is usually seen as a process, something that happens for the sake of something else, namely being or essence, those stable, perfect forms. And he strongly associates that stable being with the good. So the argument goes, if pleasure is just a process of becoming, just a movement towards something.
Like getting warm when you're cold.
Exactly. Then it can't be the ultimate good itself, because the ultimate good is a state of stable being. Pleasure is always just sort of getting there, not being there.
Ah, okay. It's the journey, maybe not the destination. And for Plato, the good is the destination.
That's a good way to put it. Now, here's one of those tricky parts that the sources really dig into. Plato tries to argue about whether pleasures can be true or false. He suggests that vicious or bad pleasures are somehow false, maybe because they're based on false opinions about what's really good.
But wait a second. A bad pleasure, it still feels pleasurable, doesn't it? Like the pleasure of eating way too much cake feels totally real, even if you know it's bad for you. Or maybe based on a false belief that cake alone brings happiness.
Exactly. And that's the tension the source analysis points right at.
Uh-huh.
A pleasure feels like a pleasure, subjectively, regardless of whether the belief causing it is true or the long-term consequences are bad. The analysis isn't shy here. It actually suggests Plato might be a bit of a tyro in dialectics on this specific point.
Tyro. Wow. Calling Plato like inexperienced or clumsy, that's quite a critique from the source. What does that tell us about reading these ancient texts?
Well, it tells us they aren't meant to be seen as, flawless, holy scripture. They're records of brilliant minds grappling with incredibly difficult ideas. The source is essentially saying that Plato's strong desire to link goodness tightly with truth might have led him to make an argument here about false pleasures that doesn't quite square with our actual subjective experience of feeling pleasure. It's a moment where the philosophical framework seems maybe a little strained by the reality it's trying to explain.
That's a really fascinating insight. Even Plato wasn't perfect in every single argument. It makes him more human in a way.
Another puzzle the sources bring up is Plato's discussion of bodily pleasures and pains happening simultaneously. He gives examples like, shivering from cold while you're warming up, or even the pleasure of scratching an itch while still feeling the pain of the itch itself. He mentioned this in the Gorgias too, actually.
Right, I remember that itch example from the Gorgias, but
Uh-huh.
does that really feel simultaneous? Like hunger and the pleasure of eating, doesn't the eating kind of push out the hunger? They feel more sequential to me, not happening at the exact same instant.
That's precisely the question the source analysis raises. It points out that usually one sensation tends to displace the other. It suggests Plato might be a bit overly influenced here by the metaphor of emptying and filling a vessel, like you're simultaneously emptying out the pain or lack and filling it with pleasure, maybe at the exact moment of transition. But it might not be the best description of the actual physical feeling for most experiences.
Okay. And he also tackles the idea held by some other philosophers that pleasure is simply the absence of pain, right?
Yes, that view was definitely around. The sources note that while Plato's discussion of pleasure is really extensive, especially focusing on measure and number, maybe it doesn't fully plumb the depths of the physical or ethical dimensions quite as much as it could have. And critically, the analysis acknowledges that, in reality, pleasure and knowledge often feel deeply intertwined in our consciousness anyway. It's hard to fully separate them.
But then he makes this absolutely critical distinction, which kind of helps him organize things and move forward, the difference between mixed pleasures and pure pleasures.
This is totally key to his final ranking. So, mixed pleasures are always tied up with some kind of pain or lack or restoration. They can happen in the body, like relieving hunger or thirst or getting warm when you're cold. Or they can be in the soul. Think of the complex, often turbulent mix of feelings in anger, fear, envy. Even interestingly, the pleasure we might get from seeing something ridiculous in others, Plato says it's mixed with a kind of ignorance or even malice. These are often excessive and unstable.
Okay. And the pure pleasures, what are they like?
These are supposed to be unalloyed with pain or lack. They come from experiencing things like beauty of form, color, sound, even smell, where the pleasure isn't about satisfying a need or removing a pain. And very importantly, the pleasure of learning, of acquiring knowledge. These pure pleasures, the sources note, do possess measure. They have a kind of clarity and proportion, unlike the potentially boundless nature of raw mixed pleasure. They stand in contrast to that constant flux of generation and destruction.
Okay, so not all pleasures are created equal in Plato's eyes. Some are just about escaping pain or filling a lack, while others seem, well, higher, cleaner somehow.
Exactly. And that distinction is absolutely vital for what he does next.
And he does a similar kind of breakdown for knowledge too, right? Sorting it into different types based on how pure or exact it is.
Yes, a parallel analysis. He looks at productive knowledge, basically the arts and crafts, and then educational or philosophical knowledge.
And even within the practical crafts, there's a hierarchy.
There is. Some crafts are more exact because they rely heavily on number and measure, think carpentry or calculation. Others involve more guesswork, more intuition, like, say, music or medicine at the time. But even within those practical arts, the use of mathematics and measurement is seen as the purer, more reliable element.
And the absolute purest knowledge of all for Plato.
That would be the philosophical use of mathematics and measurement, leading up to the very highest form, dialectic. This is the pure science concerned with understanding eternal, unchanging reality itself. The forms apprehended by reason and mind alone, completely separate from the messy, changing world of our senses.
All right, so we've got the four-part framework. We've analyzed pleasure into mixed and pure categories. We've analyzed knowledge into practical and philosophical, culminating in dialectic. How does Plato finally put this all together to figure out what the good life actually looks like?
Well, first he argues that neither extreme works on its own. A life of pure pleasure, with no wisdom or knowledge or memory, you wouldn't even be conscious of your pleasure. You'd be like an oyster. And a life of pure wisdom, completely devoid of any feeling, any pleasure at all. Socrates argues that doesn't sound like a desirable human life either.
Right, so a life of just pleasure is mindless, and a life of just mind is, well, lifeless. Neither is the complete picture.
Exactly. Which leads him to the conclusion. The best human life must therefore be a mixed life, a blend of the two.
But crucially, not just any old mix thrown together. It has to be the right mix.
Definitely not a free-for-all. Plato is very specific. He suggests the ideal mixture should include the pure sciences dialectic, pure mathematics, and also the necessary and pure pleasures. Remember those, the ones associated with beauty, learning, health, temperance.
And leaving out the messy, excessive, pain-related ones.
Precisely. Those excessive and mixed pleasures, the ones tied to folly and vice, the turbulent ones, they get excluded from this optimal blend for the good life.
And this carefully crafted mixed life isn't just good because it's, like, a sensible compromise. It's good because it connects to something higher, right?
Yes, exactly. It's good because it partakes in the nature of the good itself, that ultimate principle of value, which Plato describes almost mystically as something exceeding knowledge, exceeding essence. It's the source of all goodness that makes this particular mixture good.
And he gives us criteria, doesn't he, for what makes that mixture good? What are the key ingredients, so to speak, of the good mixture?
Yes, your sources say Plato offers three core components: truth, symmetry, and beauty. These aren't just, nice optional extras. He sees them as the single cause of the goodness within the well-mixed life. They are what make it good.
Truth, symmetry, beauty.
Wow.
That feels like a really powerful, integrated vision of what goodness entails, much more than just feeling good.
It really is. And based on all of this, the four-part framework, the analysis of pleasure and knowledge, these criteria for the good mixture, Plato finally delivers his ranking. Where do pleasure and wisdom ultimately stand in relation to this supreme good?
Okay, the big reveal. How does it all stack up in the end?
Here's the hierarchy, as presented in the source material, starting from the highest, closest to the good.
Measure, symmetry, beauty themselves, the core principles.
Things that embody those principles, the symmetrical, the beautiful, the perfect, and the mixture.
Mind and wisdom, nous and phronesis.
The sciences, arts, and true opinions that come from mind. And fifth, painless pleasures, the pure ones we talked about.
Wow. Pleasure, dead last. Fifth place.
Fifth place. And remember, that's only the pure, painless kind of pleasure. The mixed, turbulent ones didn't even make the list for the good life. But look where mind and wisdom are third place. Plato explicitly says they are 10,000 times nearer to the nature of the ultimate conqueror, the good, than pleasure is.
10,000 times nearer. Okay, so the verdict from Plato's whole intricate system in the Philebus is absolutely clear. While, yes, pure pleasure has a place in the good life, mind and wisdom are fundamentally superior. They're far, far closer to what makes life truly good, which is ultimately about being ordered by measure, symmetry, truth, and beauty.
That's the definitive conclusion he reaches through this really complex, layered structure. A powerful statement.
It's pretty incredible, isn't it, how this ancient text, with all its intricate arguments, is seen as laying the groundwork for so much future philosophical thought, even, as we mentioned earlier, things like scientific classification.
Yeah, the sources definitely highlight its influence, particularly on the development of logic and that important distinction between pure or theoretical science and applied science or technology.
And that central debate is pleasure the chief good. It absolutely didn't end with Plato. It echoes right down through the centuries, connecting directly to modern ethical theories like utilitarianism.
Absolutely. That core idea that morality should be based on maximizing happiness or pleasure, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, is a direct descendant of this very long philosophical conversation that Plato was deeply engaged in.
The source analysis even brings up that intriguing idea that Socrates himself, maybe in some other dialogues like the Protagoras, seems to act a bit like an early utilitarian, focusing heavily on calculating the consequences of actions purely in terms of pleasure and pain produced.
That's certainly one interpretation you can draw from those specific arguments, where he seems to engage in a kind of hedonistic calculus, weighing pleasures against pains.
But just like Plato himself wrestled with the complexities and potential problems of pleasure, your sources also point out some significant critiques of utilitarianism itself. What are some of those main concerns?
Well, one key issue raised is about the term happiness or utility itself. What exactly are we trying to maximize? Is it just raw pleasure, or is it something broader, more complex, like well-being or flourishing? The sources also question whether utilitarianism can fully account for concepts like justice and individual rights. Is an action only unjust if it leads to less overall happiness? What about situations where maybe violating someone's rights could arguably produce more happiness for a larger group?
Right. That feels instinctively wrong to many people. Like justice should matter for its own sake, not just as a tool for maximizing happiness.
Exactly. And there's also the concern that if you try to reduce all of morality down to this single principle of utility, you might weaken our understanding or even our language around other important moral concepts like duty, virtue, truthfulness, fairness. These words seem to carry intrinsic moral weight beyond just calculating their consequences for overall happiness. The analysis suggests utility is a really important principle for understanding part of morality, maybe a large part, but perhaps not the entire picture.
It seems like ultimately the Philebus, with all its complexity, is kind of reminding us that complex truths, like the nature of the good life, probably can't be boiled down to just one single principle, whether that's pleasure or even utility. Maybe you need multiple lenses, like Plato's own final criteria of measure, symmetry, and truth.
It definitely pushes you towards considering value in a more, let's say, nuanced, multifaceted way, rather than relying on a single, potentially oversimplified calculation.
Wow. Okay. What a deep dive that was into Plato's Philebus. We've really wrestled with some ancient, fundamental questions about what makes life genuinely good, and navigated Plato's pretty complex framework involving the infinite, the finite, the mixture, and mind.
Yeah, and we saw him critically take apart the idea that pleasure alone is the ultimate good, argue really powerfully for the superiority of wisdom, and ultimately propose that carefully balanced mixed life, guided by those profound principles: truth, symmetry, and beauty.
And we connected this millennia-old debate right up to modern ethical ideas like utilitarianism, which just shows how these fundamental questions about value are still incredibly relevant and alive today.
It really does leave you with something to chew on, doesn't it? If, in Plato's final considered view, even the purest, painless pleasures only rank fifth in the hierarchy of the good life, well, what does that suggest about our own priorities today? What else, beyond just seeking happiness or maximizing pleasure, truly contributes to a life that is good in that deeper Platonic sense, a life that possesses measure, symmetry, and beauty?